Hello, I am this week's host on the Masters of Supply Chain Weekly News Digest. I am joined today by my good friend Bill Hutchinson. Now, Bill was Chief Supply Chain Officer at WestRock, but comes with a wealth of experience through different retail roles throughout his career, including Sears, including Chewy. And like myself, he started back originally in Anderson Consulting. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
It's a pleasure, David. Lots going on, lots to talk about.
It is, and it's surprising that we've been over the last few weeks on the News Digest, we've been trying to talk about supply chain other than tariffs, but unfortunately we haven't been able to get there. And so again today, as much as I would love to talk about technology and other things, I think it's really important that we continue to digest, some of the weekend's news over tariffs. So on Friday, it was 145% on China. And then there was this Customs and Border Patrol declaration that came out late on Friday afternoon and said, oh, there's exemptions, and those exemptions equate to about $101 billion worth of imports from China, including smartphones, PCs, and other electronics. It's Monday morning, and again, there's now another news article which says, well, hold on a minute, that's not exactly what the president meant. What he said was that there's actually going to be a different tariff bucket, which is going to be focused around semiconductors. So it's Monday morning, Bill. How are you thinking about all of this?
Yeah, it's interesting, David, as you follow the bouncing ball. I came into the weekend thinking the U.S. was in a pretty good place from a trade perspective to be able to reset the table with our trading partners minus China. And, there was this carrot of, what we would import from China that potentially could be redistributed to our trading partners. More, I think, than industry actually coming back and doing meaningful manufacturing in the U.S. Given some of the labor challenges we have and labor shortages in the U.S., I don't candidly see massive lines to work in factories. So, I think that's a bit unrealistic. But I do think that the spoils could go to the trading partners that come to the table, with the most compelling value proposition to the Trump administration. So from that perspective, that was pretty interesting. The companies that were going to suffer, though, some of whom, you and I have spent some time with, the tech companies getting away from that skilled labor base in China, that supply base in China is very, very difficult to do quickly. We're seeing Apple and others diversify a bit, going to India. So folks have gone to Vietnam, but to move away from that supply base in a meaningful way, I think is what prompted but wait, we want to leave semiconductors, we want to leave PCs off this list, just to try not to hurt, some of the large importers of those products, recognizing that those supply chains are going to be pretty slow to move. We've also got the de minimis tax thing to talk about, which is pretty interesting. Right. As I've got two daughters in their 20s, and I've actually seen them take a hard look at what Shein and Temu and what some of that product does to the environment, and maybe take a little bit of a different tact in terms of how they think about that. Now it's even going to be more painful economically for those companies. So, there might be some goodness environmentally that comes out of this as well. We'll see.
Well, we are looking for that silver lining, and as the old saying goes, every silver lining has a cloud, and so we're trying to figure out a little bit about that now. But back to your point, and I did numerous articles and reports, interviews last week, and I was trying to get across the point that this is not as simple as moving a factory. These factories have an ecosystem that supports them, from a raw material, from a sub-assembly perspective. And so even the onshoring premise, it's not that simple. It's going to take time, it's going to take investment, and it's going to take a lot of energy. And even if you are able to do all of those things, bearing in mind that even the steel and the aluminium that you're going to use to build your factory has now actually got a tariff on it as well, then you have to find the skilled labor. And the skilled labor it's not just standing on the street corner waiting to be snapped up. This would cause another shift. There's a crazy statistic that I read, that in 2024 there was 12 million people in the US who listed content creation as their primary source of income. Like, content creation, that is YouTube, social media, all of those things. But those are 12 million people who used to do something else. and 12 million people who are no longer, if you like, available in the workforce. So I think that these problems do start to stack up, and the de minimis rule is going to be very interesting because, again, over the last couple of weeks, what we've seen is, first of all, there was massive availability in terms of air freight coming out of China, because now all of those goods were going to be coming through customs. And then suddenly, whenever there was a slight reprieve in the tariff, there was a huge surge in volumes again going on air freight. So all the charters were all filled coming out of China last week. So it's almost as if the supply chains they're having to do this knee-jerk reaction depending on the news of the day, and they're trying to accommodate. And I did see this morning that now we're starting to see backlogs in the US ports. So the port of New Jersey is now backlogged, partly because of the volume, but also partly because of a lack of understanding of the tariffs that have been implemented and how to actually gauge those. So in your history, you've obviously been, very big in terms of importing lots of apparel, lots of consumer goods. How does a supply chain react when there's so much turmoil?
It's interesting, for all of us who have gone to dinner on a Friday night, walked into a restaurant without a reservation, realized the line was long, and decided to go someplace else, probably forgetting the fact that the next place is going to have an equally long line. As we move our supply chains around, as we decide, hey, there's going to be a disruption on the West Coast, let's move things all water to the east. As we decide, hey, there's going to be a labor disruption on the East Coast ports, let's do something different. COVID hits. How do we want to think about product coming out of Asia and some of the fits and starts there? As you well know, that the bullwhip effect and the stopping and starting and the trying to not follow the crowd mentality of everyone going to a different place and finding yourself in a queue that was longer than it would have been in your current supply chain. We had all war gamed. I'm sure you did it at Microsoft. We did at Dell, looking at what the next China was as an example. And we did this.
Right.
I mean, I left Dell 11 years ago. So we were doing this, 12, 13, 14 years ago, given where labor costs in China were, given the fact that we knew that at some point we were going to have to diversify the supply base. And it's interesting because the thought has always been there. The investment to do it, though, which is massive, as you mentioned, has been difficult to come by for many organizations as they're measured
Right.
quarter by quarter based on their productivity. So as soon as that disruption ends, folks have a short-term memory and kind of go back to the status quo, and that's a dangerous thing. I think some of the changes we're seeing now, particularly as it relates to U.S.-China relations, could change some of those supply chains and actually force nearshoring. Like I said, I don't see a lot of apparel, for example, manufacturing coming back to the U.S. in any meaningful way.
Right.
But do I see us maybe forging stronger relationships with other partners in Asia, potentially Vietnam, if we can get Vietnam to not only sort of eliminate some of the tariffs on our products, but also some of the funny practices around, shell companies sending things from China through Vietnam to the U.S. to minimize their tariff exposure. I think those countries benefit a ton, and I think what the U.S. has to offer there is really this volume that we've done with China for certain industries. We can move that around. That's going to be a lot easier to do than the tech supply chains. I think certainly the folks of the U.S. government recognize that. They also probably recognize that the Chinese have more control of the rare earth supply chain, which, obviously way down in the supply chain, if you think about tier 3, tier 4, is going to be very critical to the tech infrastructure going forward, the size of the chips we create, and obviously all the tech that goes into that. So China has thought ahead and certainly has been very strategic as to how they've thought about this. This is not going to go away quickly, in my estimation.
And I think it's a really interesting point, though, Bill, because I think that what we will see is we will start to see, and I don't really like to call it decentralization, but I think it's going to be more of a democratization of certain supply chains throughout, some additional emerging economies, and that's because they are easier to move. I think high tech is still going to be very challenging, but it is going to be interesting to see, how that shift happens and how quickly that shift is able to happen. But it's still going to be a challenge. It's, even when you don't have as deep an ecosystem and infrastructure, it's still challenging to pick things up and move. And then you've got to worry about quality, you've got to worry about compliance, you've got to worry about security, all the things that you have taken for granted because you had war gamed this out and you'd set in place your supply chain. It does become a little bit, it becomes a little bit different. My guidance to companies, certainly over the last 3 or 4 weeks, has been hurry up and wait. Any knee-jerk reaction, any strategic shift, it just doesn't seem appropriate at this time because it is so volatile and it does change on such a regular pace. When you were in the job, when you were in the chief supply chain position, how did you deal with this? What went through your mind whenever you were faced with these black swan type of events?
As you go back over time, and you've seen some of the same ones I have, the floods in Thailand that wiped out a lot of the hard drive capacity in the industry, even disruptions in airlift capacity from the volcanoes we saw in Iceland. I mean, there were things that were short-lived, we knew were short-lived, and we did some heroic things to maintain continuity of supply to get through them, right, because there was a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, or on the other side of the ash cloud, however you want to. But to your point, I think this is different. You could find yourself making some mistakes if you're not careful. But I think diversifying the supply base is something that is typically done, in a retail environment in partnership with your merchant teams, your sourcing teams, the supply chain organization really needs to get together and look at this and say, as winners emerge from these ongoing trade negotiations, for example, with the U.S., how should we think about, positioning our supply base a little bit differently to avoid some of these risks? And I would encourage folks to look not just at the current tariff situation, but also let's look at some of the freight capacity concerns we'd had out of Asia before, which were prompting folks to go to Mexico, which were prompting folks to go to other parts of Latin America. Those things need to be considered as well. So I would try to take this opportunity, because it's a hot topic with every board, every CEO, every CFO, certainly, as they look at their P&L. But how do we think about positioning this, using this impetus to create some flexibility in the supply chain that maybe investments haven't gotten over the line before, just given the fact that other events might have been a little shorter in duration?
No, again, I think that's a great point in terms of use the crisis as an opportunity and use it as a time to really think strategically, not just around the impact of the tariffs, but in terms of what does your supply chain look like in 5 years and 10 years. There's never been a better time to actually put the energy into that thought process. And yet again, we've been proven. We went through COVID. We all have the scars from a supply chain perspective with the things that we had to deal with. And we vowed at the time that it would never happen again and we would be different. And yet 5 years on, you kind of look at it a little bit and go, did we really do enough, or did we get a little bit complacent very quickly? This is another one of those cycles. And the cycle this time, it needs to be taken seriously, because the one thing that we have learned is there will always be another event. It's never going to remain, in a status quo. And that's a challenging thing for supply chain, but it's also why we exist. We exist to solve the world's problems. And this is a good time for us to step up and actually show how to do that. When you're thinking about, the challenges that you've been through in your career, and like me, you've dealt with a lot of these black swan events before. What is it that how do you keep calm? How do you keep the rational the rational thought process going, especially when your teams and the people who you're charging every day to solve supply chain problems, they're panicking. They're trying to figure out, what do we have to do next?
I love the point you made. Out of crisis comes opportunity. And I think that as supply chain professionals, we're compensated to outwit, if you will, or potentially move faster than our competitors do with some of the same information in the market. When this happens, how do we ensure that our supply chain has continuity of supply for raw materials? How do we ensure that we're developing a supply base in partnership with the rest of the organization that is more durable than some of our competitors? There's a lot of complaining on LinkedIn, and I think complaining is always the easy thing to do, but man, out of this disruption comes massive opportunity. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see who capitalizes on this, who pivots faster than others. What disruption comes out of this, as we've seen, the emergence of disruptors who, potentially displace massive, organizations that have been in the industry for a while just by thinking differently, making different investments. There's never been a better time to think about that with, some of the advancements we've made in automation, some of the advances we've made with AI and robotics. How does that, complement the labor structure, for example, you would need to pivot your supply chain and put it in a different place? So I think we've got better tools than we've had before. But I think, those scenarios, the wargaming, I don't see enough sometimes supply chain folks partnering with merchants to really start to understand, why aren't we doing something near shore? Why aren't we doing something in Latin America? How do we push on that? Just like we would push on a challenge in our existing supply chain, how do we explore the realm of the possible to look at some of those things and potentially be one of the first movers in one of these new markets? I do think, David, there are going to be winners out of these trade conversations in terms of folks who potentially can grow their export base into the U.S., for example, right, or Europe pretty dramatically. I also think that a lot of the intellectual property concerns we've had with China historically in tech, in retail and other industries, we're now finally talking about those more directly than we were before. That has a long-term benefit to the supply chain. There's a lot of short-term pain. It's going to be painful, you said, to sort of follow the bouncing ball and ensure you can execute. Last thing I'll say is you've got to recognize that your execution team, the folks in your trade compliance group, the folks in your logistics group, the folks in country, for example, if you've got a team in Asia, are just overwhelmed with the workload that's involved in a lot of this whipsawing back and forth. So as the leader of the organization, ensuring that your folks have resources that you can pivot to potentially support them might help you with some turnover, might help you just make sure that you're doing the right thing for your folks.
That's fantastic, Bill, and I agree with all of your points. I do wholeheartedly believe that the crisis is the mother of invention here, and I think that there's a real opportunity to start to embrace some of the technology that we've seen over the last years in terms of building that next element of supply chain. Bill Hutchinson, thank you so much for joining me today. As always, an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Really love your insights today. Hey, thanks everyone for listening to our weekly news digest. If you like us, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. If you don't like what we're talking about, just let us know and we'll change it up. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, David. Take care.